So Haley was raised orally deaf, and Haley's personal experiences have bolstered her professional endeavors, including traveling on the Americans with Disabilities Act tour bus to educate communities, supporting international exchange and development programs with Mobility International USA and the Mandela Washington Fellowship, and serving as the member of the Developmental Disabilities Council. She is currently pursuing her Master's of Public Affairs degree at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. So please let me welcome Haley. Let us welcome.
Well, hi everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. It is really, really wonderful to connect with groups like yours and to learn more about the work that you're doing. I do want to start off with a couple of just things about me and my communication needs. So I identify as orally deaf, and what that means is I'm a lowercase deaf. So I did not grow up with deafness as a cultural identity. I grew up in a hearing family. I grew up with lots and lots of speech therapy, and I can debate the pros and cons of that all night long, but I won't go into that right now. But the reality is that I do communicate verbally, but in order to really fully understand things, I use a mixture of captioning and interpreting. So I do have two interpreters here tonight that will help me. That's Maria and Misha. And so any comments or questions that you have, you can feel free to ask at any point. I have a very short period of time, so I'll try to do my best to stay on topic, but they will be sure to interpret your comments for me. So, like I said, short period of time. I'm trying to cover a few different things related to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'll call it the UN CRPD. And I'll also be talking a little bit about Disabled People's Organization and how that connects to the CRPD. So Disabled People's Organizations, DPOs for short. And actually, I might need to, can you move into the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So just a quick introduction about myself. I know Chrissy already did a pretty good job of covering the bases, but I do work as a staff member at the Disability Resource Center at the University of Minnesota. So that means that I work one-on-one with students and instructors and staff around campus to really make sure that we're creating a accessible, equitable, and inclusive environment for students with disabilities across all aspects of campus. And then I'm also a student at the Humphrey School, so I get to really dive into my interests around disability policy and disability rights organizing. I'm originally from the East Coast, so I'm kind of new to the Midwest scene, and so I'm hoping to meet a few of you tonight because I'm still very new here. So we'll move into the next slide. So I kind of went over this quickly, but just a few key words. So UN CRPD, DPOs, and then I'll be using the terms people with disabilities and disabled people somewhat interchangeably. My preference is to use the term disabled people. That's identity first language. I find that at least for me, feels more empowering. I see disability as a part of my identity, and it shapes who I am. But there are some people that prefer what's called person first language, which, there's some debate about which terms to use, but, you choose what you prefer. And then I may also reference deaf and hard of hearing, which I use the acronym DHH. So we'll move into the next slide. So a few basics about the UN CRPD. Sorry, I'm getting my notes here. But it's an international agreement that identifies the rights of persons with disabilities across the globe. And its intent is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and freedoms by all people with disabilities. Now that's kind of a mouthful, but really what it is to create a shared understanding of disability rights as a part of human rights. It is very comprehensive. It was the first comprehensive human rights treaty of the 21st century. It had 50 articles. It came together really in rapid time compared to other UN treaties. And it's been signed and ratified by, I think, I have it on my next slide, but I think it's 176 countries. It's important to note that the US is the only developed nation that has not ratified the convention. We can make some assumption about why that might be, but it is important to note that the US has signed it, which means they're kind of saying, oh, that's kind of nice to acknowledge it, but they're not held to any of the standards or principles that are outlined in the CRPD. What's really cool about the CRPD is that it's one of the first treaties that was drafted and written with lots of collaboration from disabled people's organizations and civil society organizations. Up until the point that it was drafted, that wasn't very common. So that really does speak to the power of the disability community and the need to ensure that this treaty adhere to the principle of nothing about us without us. Because of that involvement, there are several articles in the convention that were put in place because of advocacy from DPOs. This also really began an opportunity to ensure that human rights and disability rights were connected. Up until that point, a lot of development organizations, while they were doing work that maybe impacted people with disabilities, they weren't really explicitly making that connection. And I think a lot of DPOs also were not necessarily recognizing the opportunities of being part of human rights. They were kind of off and doing advocacy and doing really cool things, but they weren't connected to a lot of the United Nations work and like reviews and basically like complaint processes that you can engage in. So very cool. So we're going to move into the next slide. How am I doing on time? Okay. I have no concept of time when I'm talking. So the CRPD was basically adopted by the United Nations in 2006. And then in 2008, it was opened up for signatures. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that the number of people or the number of state parties that signed, it was record-breaking. How many people, I keep saying people, but states and countries signed on. And then 92 countries have signed the optional protocol, which is an additional aspect of the CRPD that basically allows a more formalized complaint process that's attached to the CRPD. So we'll move into the next slide. And so I do want to talk a little bit more about the connection between the CRPD and what that means at the ground level for DPOs. So this slide, it says Article 4 of the UN CRPD says that signing parties must, and it's a pretty long-winded slide, I apologize for all the text, is adopt appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures consistent with CRPD, modify or abolish existing laws, regulations, customs, and practices that discriminate against persons with disabilities, and takes into account the protection and promotion of the human rights of persons with disabilities in all policies and programs. Now that's kind of a mouthful. There's a lot there, but this is really broad terminology. And when you consider how general the principles are throughout the convention, it gives countries a lot of discretion in how they interpret that and guarantee those rights. And so what does that look like when you bring that to the ground level, when you bring that to the grassroots? So we'll move into the next slide. Moving along. So I wanted to use one specific example. So I had an opportunity to work with some different partners in Mozambique, and actually, kind of a fun fact, I was able to travel there with Maria as an interpreter, and so she also was able to see a lot of this. But Mozambique ratified the CRPD in 2012, and they have pretty limited articulation of the rights of people with disabilities. They don't currently have a broad-reaching disability rights law. They have some pieces of the Constitution that reference people with disabilities, but it's not very clear how that's enforced. So there's some work to be done. Well, anyways, in my time there, I was able to work with what was considered one of the largest DPOs in the country. It's cross disability. It had affiliates in all major parts of the country. But what was really, really interesting is that there was a lot of division because there was another major DPO that was focused on disability rights. And so what was happening was there was all this segmentation in the work that was being done, and a lot of energy and time was being poured into competition with those two different DPOs. And I've read some research from other countries, and the same is true in Nigeria. There's two major DPOs that are kind of at odds with each other and kind of staking their claim over their territory. And one of the other things that's happening is, so I do want to acknowledge my view is very American. It's very white. It's very, I have privileges that kind of cloud my view and create some biases, right? So this is my interpretation of it, and this is what I've learned from work with them. But essentially, a lot of the social and political power and the social capital was held largely by men with physical disabilities. In some cases, maybe physical disabilities that didn't impact their navigation all that much, and so they had a very specific view of what disability was, and they were advocating for very specific aspects of disability rights. And the majority of them were from a very centralized part of Mozambique in Maputo, so a very urban area. So they were representing the interests of an urban population. And so what was happening was their kind of focus on their interaction with other DPOs. Meanwhile, there are government agencies that are in the process of drafting a disability rights bill. And it turned out while we were there, shortly prior, a draft of a bill had been released to the public with virtually no consultation with the disability rights community. And so there was a lot of backlash to that and a lot of consultation about like how to move forward, how to say this bill, quite frankly, it stinks and we need to figure out what to do now. And so that's when the CRPD began to become more prominent, because for a long time, disability rights communities and advocacy has really been centered around disability rights and hasn't necessarily been connected to human rights and United Nations conventions. And so they were able to say, look, this doesn't align with the principles espoused in the CRPD. We need to go back and review this and make changes and then propose something else. And so what's really cool is that DPOs in Mozambique and especially in Maputo are now working with the Human Rights Center at a local university. And that is something that didn't really happen all that often before. And I was able to be a part of what seemed like pretty initial conversations around that. And I know there's quite a ways to go, but it did point to some key challenges that I've seen in other reports and other research. So I'm gonna move right into that. And that is, so the nature of disability is really, really interesting in a developing context, because poverty can lead to disability, and disability can also lead to poverty, and that's true in the U.S. as well. But what it does is it results in disproportionate rates of disability in especially deprived areas. The other nuance of disability is that it's incredible. There's tons of segmentation in the disability community, and that could be based on disability type, communication needs, regional characteristics, regional languages, politics, gender, and so on. And that many of these groups, by virtue of being so marginalized, already have a complete lack of access to various systems. And oftentimes that especially translates to legal and political systems. I also mentioned that limited resources can really lead to like DPOs grabbing resources and forcing more competition with each other than focusing on the greater picture, the greater arc. And that DPO leaders often, are those with the greatest social and political capital. So they're kind of driving the primary goals of those CPLs. So it's this question of, with the CRPD, it's rights in theory to some extent. There are implementation mechanisms, but in developing contexts, that has been really challenging to figure out and to bring into reality. So it's this conundrum of disability rights in theory versus rights in practice. So really, I think that there needs to be a lot more investment in local leadership, in local government learning how to better work with disability rights communities, but also disability rights communities having the opportunity to learn how to better navigate legal and political systems in their countries. That can be really, really very complicated. And so I wanted to just lead into, some potential ways for you as a group to take action. And I really do think it's starting small, and it's really starting to think about who you throw your support behind. I think a lot of people think that they are supporting disability rights and disability access, but sometimes I think tend to throw their support behind like these bigger, prettier, really well-established organizations that often aren't run by people with disabilities. And so, one example that I'd like to get out of the way right away is Autism Speaks. It's not led by people with disabilities. It doesn't promote progressive opportunities and outcomes for people with disabilities. And so a really good alternative is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And I really do encourage you to dig a little deeper in terms of the support that you provide. The other thing is, I think a lot of social justice groups completely leave disability off the table when they're setting up events and programs. I see lots of heads nodding. I love that. That's awesome. And I think a lot of people wait for people with disabilities to come or disabled people to come instead of saying, let's look at our events. Who's not in the room? Who's not here? Why are they not here? I think a lot of people forget to ask why. And to look at where you're hosting your events, to look at transportation, to look at childcare, to look at all these other aspects that might play into why someone with a disability might not show up. That kind of leads right into the next point, which is planning for access from the beginning. I do have a quick handout that I can pass out. I also have digital versions of it that I would be happy to send if you're interested. One big thing that a lot of groups forget is they forget to budget for disability. I think it's generally a good matter of practice to put a line item in your budget that focuses on accommodation, 10 to 12%. I think is a good idea. And then the other thing is, of course, educating and advocating for ratification of a CRPD when the climate allows it. It will help all of us go much further with our work. So I think that's just about it for now, but if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, anything that you'd like to share, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll introduce you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Haley. I think that was just fantastic to be able to get this global context and view. So our title today, I actually didn't call it out, is Global Local Disability Rights Movement, Inclusive Education, Self-Advocacy, and Non-Discrimination. And so Haley was able to really give us a good sense of opportunities and challenges of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and advocating with global disability persons organizations on a global front. We now are very lucky to have Roqayah Ajaj with us, and she's going to be speaking from actually her own personal experiences with a window into using an intercultural lens to support students with visual impairments from Saudi Arabia to Minnesota. So, Rokia, thank you for being here. While Rokia is getting her mic on, I'll just introduce her in a little bit more of a lens for some of our viewing audience, that she's also a graduate student, completing her master's degree at the University of Minnesota in Special Education and Comparative International Development Education. Rokia is also from Saudi Arabia, and she is legally blind. She has always been interested in raising awareness about people with disabilities and advocating for their rights. So thank you again.
Thanks so much. Well, good evening. I'm is it just this one? Sorry. Should I stand here?
Yeah, the podium right there.
Yeah, if you can stand at the podium. Right up here, yeah.
All right.
Because we have a few different mics that are going, and you can nod to me, and I'll make the change in your PowerPoint.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to share with you my story and experience of raising awareness from Saudi Arabia to the United States about people with disability. So I was born with retinitis pigmentosa, which causes my vision to be decreased over time. And I was born into a large family with elderly parents. I had 3 other siblings who are also blind, and one of them has another disability. I always feel it's my responsibility to share. Sorry, did you flip the slide?
I'm now where you're growing up in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, sorry. So,
I think you need to get closer to the podium.
okay.
Does that sound something?
It's all right, we're going to share. So.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. You're good.
Sorry. So, I always feel it's my responsibility to take care of all of my siblings, including my younger sister who is also blind. I do not want her to face any challenges that I have faced in my life. So I received my education in a general K-12 schools that did not have any accommodation for people who are blind. I had been always the only student who is blind in all of my classes. I recognized that teachers, students treated me different than the others. I had so many challenges in my classes, mainly because I did not know how to interact with them, and they did not know how to interact with me. For example, a math teacher asked me to read an equation that she wrote on a board, and I wasn't able to, so she thought that I did not understand the lesson. Despite all of the challenges, I graduated from high school in 2008. Although I did not have a high grade, I was admitted as a part-time student to King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, which is in the western side of Saudi Arabia, where I am from the east. There, I was introduced to so many technologies and screen readers, and I had my own assistant. I had all the tools that enabled me to be a successful student. I was surprised of the different technology available, and I wish if I had known about them earlier because it would make my education so much easier. I finished my freshman year as a part-time student with a high grade, which enabled me to become a full-time student. I studied mass media and journalism because I often heard students with disability talking about the challenges and the obstacles that they were facing in their education, in their college settings. I felt it's my responsibility to raise awareness through media about how to work with people with disability, like who are blind, and or anyone who has any disability. I therefore took any chances in my classes to do a project that would help raise awareness on campus. I started by interviewing people who overcome their obstacles, who are people with disability. Hearing their stories and the obstacles that they face and the challenges to live an independent life in this society motivated me to do more projects and to do more projects in a larger scale to really actually help raise awareness. So I started, I developed an organization, an event called Technology Awareness. In this event, I worked with a team of blind students. All of us were blind. And we invited people not only not only the students who are blind, but also sighted people. We mostly targeted professors. So it was not only for people who are blind, but also for professors. By the end of that event, we had a discussion like Q&A like between the students and the professors. They have a really nice discussion about the challenges that they face and the obstacles. Soon after the event, a friend of mine who was blind came to me and she said that her professor changed the way how she interacted with her. So I felt like it's okay, so it triggered my interest to do more project. For my senior project, I developed a television project in order to educate people, blind and sighted, about the ability of the visually impaired. I want to share with them and inform them about the different resources available that would broaden their ability and would foster their independence. With the exception of the camera operator, everyone involved in that program was blind, from me as a director and to the interviewee and the interviewers. For my effort in these projects, I received the Arab Youth Council Award in 2015 for being the first blind woman who conducted a project in this nature. Thank you. Thank you. I got a scholarship to study abroad in the United States, so I came here in 2013. When I came here, I studied English for 2 years, and then I was admitted to my master's at the University of Minnesota. I chose to study special education because I thought once I really understand disabilities and different kinds of disabilities, I will be able to raise awareness and advocate for them strongly. I also was interested in leadership and policy, so I added another major in organization leadership and policy development. So I have them both. To facilitate my studies, I worked with an access assistant through the Disability Resource Center at the University of Minnesota, DRC. From my experience working with them, I realized that readers are not being trained of how to read out loud clearly to best support the student need. So I developed a training manuals for the access assistant and provided a proposal of how to implement these trainings along with other areas of improvement like note-taking and first interaction between the student and the assistant. This training was implemented by the DRC at University of Minnesota in 2016. When I started my study, I realized that many of my professors have not had any student who's blind before, similar to Saudi Arabia. So I wanted to help them know how to interact with me and with other students who was blind. So I did a research, and I developed a training targeting professors and faculty working in college and universities to help them support the students who are blind in their classes. And this manual or this training, I covered the journey that people who are blind go through in universities, and also some of the technology that would help them, would help students who are blind be more successful, and also some tips of lectures, like how important to use universal design for teaching in a class that has someone who's blind, and also some tips that would help the professor help the students engage with each other, like the student who was blind and also the other students, to help break the barriers between everyone in the class so that everyone feel comfortable and welcome. This has not been implemented yet. When I developed that training, I started thinking more deeply of how to make the campus more inclusive for people who are blind and also for people with disability. So I always face some challenges. For example, when I go to the cafeteria with my assistant, the cashier would ask, "What does she want?" Meaning that they assume that I did not know how to speak for myself. Or when I walk in the street and I ask for direction, someone will say, "Go that way." And I did not know where they are pointing to. So I did research. I would like to know whether I am the only person who's facing these problems or it's a common problem. I found out it's a common problem that people who are blind face around the globe. It's a common assumption that people with disability are not intellectually capable. So I developed my most recent project last spring, which called Using Intercultural Lens When Working with Students Who Are Blind in College Settings. I targeted everyone in campus, like from the professors, faculty, staff, and graduate assistants. Building in my previous project, I added sections of how to assist someone who's blind in the street, in the cafeteria, in the offices, etc. Just how to work with them in general. Because I felt like because I think this project will help everyone know how to work with each other. This has not been implemented yet, but I'm hoping to find a way to share them with a wide audience. I have a goal in my mind. I want to make changes. I don't want anyone to face any of the challenges that I have faced. This is why I'm moving forward to my PhD at the University of Minnesota next fall. And I think together we can make a difference by making the society more inclusive for everyone. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, that was just fantastic. So thank you once again, and we will have the first two speakers up with our next speaker to receive some questions before we then go into the final ones. So right now we're going to jump over to Laurie Kincaid, which I have had the pleasure being office mates with at the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. She is going to be presenting on global inclusive education initiatives and recommendations. And she currently is in her third year of psychology in a PhD program at the University of Minnesota. Her main research interests include issues of diversity and equity in schools and training programs, the student-teacher relationship, mental health, and social emotional learning programs in schools, inclusive education for students with disabilities, and self-determination of people with disabilities. So she has loads of interest and wonderful experience. So please help me in welcoming her to the stage. Thanks, Laura.
Well, hello everyone. I am so honored to be here with you all and have these really important conversations with you. And I'm honored to follow the previous amazing presentations, and I'm so excited to talk about all of this afterwards. So I hope we have some really great conversations and questions to follow. So as Christy mentioned, I work at the Institute on Community Integration with her, and I work with two people there whose main research interests are self-determination and inclusive education. So we've done a couple of projects that I would like to highlight today. That's what I'll be talking about. Overall, I'm going to briefly talk about context and how context is really important before I give global initiatives and recommendations, and then I will briefly highlight our 4 recommendations. There are many more, and I'd love to talk about more, but with a short amount of time, I kind of chose these 4 because I thought I could address them quickly. So before I talk about our project and what our main recommendations are for global inclusive ed, I think it's really important to talk about social and political and educational context and how that plays into recommendations. And I think every country is at a different stage, and I think we have to consider what we've been doing here in the US in the context of the law with IDEA and ADA and the 504 of Rehabilitation Act, but also in society where we're at right now with attitudes and stereotypes and all of the other barriers that people might face here in the US, but how those might be different in other countries and other contexts. So the recommendations that I may be giving today may be more or less not as appropriate for other countries, depending on where they're at in some of these same topics and issues. But nonetheless, I think it's a starting point of discussion of what we're doing here in the US that may or may not be showing promise. And in addition to that, I don't want to at all make it sound like the US has it all going on, because I think everyone has areas to learn and grow, and I think the US does as well. I view inclusive education more on a spectrum rather than a one or the other, and I think we still have areas to grow, but I think we have some promising strategies that some of the research has shown, and that's what I would like to talk about today. So So what Brian and Renata and myself are doing at the University of Minnesota, we've now written 2 articles on some strategies that are used here in the United States that show research promise. And we published one of them over in a Czech Republic journal to disseminate it over in Europe, and the other one is in press right now. But both of them kind of highlight the US context and what we're doing currently, but also a couple of the recommendations that we would recommend that have a little bit more research support. So the first recommendation that I want to talk about today is something called response to intervention. Response to intervention is a US phenomenon. It's not utilized as much in other countries, but it is a multi-approach to identification and support for students with disabilities. And to talk about it a little bit more, I am going to address kind of the key components of what do we have to have response to intervention in schools. And really what it is we are, you can go to the next one, thank you. You can see here that first we have to have ongoing assessments of all students. We want to really make sure that we're capturing the students that need some of that additional support. And we'll be doing universal screening to do that. And then you want to make sure that you're progress monitoring the students that you're doing interventions with to make sure that we're being responsive to their needs. Is it working or is it not? And what can we do to better support them? And next, that we're making those data-based decisions. So we're not changing based off of our own assumptions or things that we think are working. We're looking at the data to make sure that we're doing things in an appropriate and empirical way. I'll talk about differentiated instruction in a little bit more depth on the next slide, but other things that are involved in RTI are there are multiple tiers of increasing support. There are a multitude of diverse students in our schools, and it's such a beautiful place, but people need varying levels of support, and they have varying abilities to make sure that we're giving them the amount of support that they need, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But then also that we're using evidence-based curriculum and interventions, and that we have problem-solving teams. So there are teams in the school that are analyzing these things and making sure that we're matching interventions to support the needs of the students. Christy, you can go ahead. So this is the model of response to intervention. So if we think about kind of like prevention science and medicine, you would assume that the large majority of a culture or a society can just respond to preventative approaches or core instruction in the schools. So that's this big tier 1 is what they call it. So these students are the ones who are going to be responding just to tier 1 instruction, and they will get along just fine with that. But then there are other students who need a little bit more support, and that's the tier 2. So they're going to be getting some group instruction maybe, or just a little bit of extra support, accommodation, modifications. And then some students still may not respond to that, and they need even a little bit more intensive one-on-one support. That's tier 3. And that's going to be more frequent, more intense, maybe with someone who's a little bit more specialized. And then some people still might not respond to that, and then they might need to have a special education evaluation and get supports in that way. But the overall assumption in this is that we can assume inclusive education and start at tier 1 and see if students can respond to that first before going up the model. Go ahead, Christy. So I briefly talked about differentiated instruction, and that's one aspect of response to intervention. And what differentiated instruction is in the classroom, you can have a multitude of students with varying abilities, and you can address their abilities by differentiating your instruction to different students who need a variety of things. So you can do that based off of content. So how will the student access your information? Maybe they need a different reading level, but they can do the exact same assignment that the other students are, but it's just a different level. Or maybe it's by process. What activities does the student engage in? Maybe they need manipulatives or pictures or a variety of accommodations, but they can still do the same activities. Maybe products. What is the student's end goal? Maybe they're creating something different. Maybe you have a different rubric for them or a different end goal or product. And then lastly, the environment. How does the classroom operate and feel? Are we showing our students that we want it to be inclusive with how we organize our classroom? And this is not only for students with disabilities, but from students with different cultures as well, and what we're representing in our curriculum and how we speak and what we're posting on our walls and all of those things. So I think what I really wanted to highlight is all of this can happen in that general education classroom, and we can include all of these, a variety of students there by differentiating our instruction. The next recommendation that we talked about in these papers is something called peer-assisted learning strategies. And what this is you're using peers in your classroom to give students a little bit of extra support, but also embed them in the social interactions of the classroom and really make sure that students are getting to know each other and learning from each other. And that goes from people with disabilities to people without, and the other way around. We're learning from each other in these interactions. So what you do with peer-assisted learning strategies is you assess your students, figure out what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and then you pair them based on proficiency. So one student is more proficient than the other, and the more proficient student serves as the tutor the first time around in the academic material. They go through it, they kind of serve as the coach and give feedback, and then they switch and they do it the other way around. So they're learning from each other and engaging in the material in a very social way. The other beautiful thing about peer-assisted learning strategies is that this can also all happen in the general education classroom, hence inclusive education. Okay, and my last recommendation is something called inclusive service learning. So I think this also addresses some societal attitudinal barriers as well, because what this is it's getting our students involved in the community with things that they're passionate about that are related to the content areas that they're learning about in their classrooms. But then as that happens, they're also getting out in the community, and the community is seeing them engaged, and other people are learning about your topic and who you are and what you're passionate about. Excuse me. So through these things, we have a multitude of diverse young adults who are now in the community with differing abilities, who are contributing to the community, and everyone is seen as a valuable person in society because we're giving back. But then they also take that information that they learned through their service learning activity, they take it back to the classroom, and then they are able to reflect on it and relate it back to the content that they learned. And that's my presentation.
You can actually stay up here, because I think what we're going to do, if we can actually call Haley and Roqayah and Laurie up here, I think we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about what they have actually presented before we have our final speaker, Rick, come. And so we'll have at least a way to dialogue around kind of that global context, although some of their recommendations obviously led to local applications too. So are there any questions?
Well, I'm interested in CRPD, and is it, so when was that ratified in Mozambique?
And do you all mind coming over this way so that we can kind of hopefully be close enough to the mics? And I think, who has the lapel mic? Somebody?
It's on in the podium.
Oh, it's on the podium. So, okay, yeah. No, that's perfect.
So Rick, you asked when the CRPD was ratified in Mozambique. It was ratified in 2012. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it obviously it is taking a long time to really fully permeate and to realize the full promise of what that means for society there.
I was interested in the last presentation where you talked about setting an environment where multi kinds of needs could be addressed, and I was really interested what that would be like.
Yeah. Would an example help maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's say, for example, a 5th grade classroom is maybe learning some pre-algebra. So the main general education teacher could be addressing the general education part of the class, the kind of the core tier 2, where they're making sure that they don't need any help and they already have their assignment. And then there might be another small group on a different side of the room where you have a teaching assistant, where they're kind of maybe teaching them some of the skills that you need before algebra if they're behind, or maybe they're doing the exact same curriculum but just a little bit slower with a little bit more support. And then you could also have a special education teacher in the classroom, maybe working one-on-one or giving some behavioral support to one specific student in the class. I've also seen it where you just have multiple groups and you can have different students working on different areas. If you have gifted students who are way far ahead, they can just be working on a completely different assignment. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, great.
It sounds like the country school where I grew up.
Oh, yeah?
More,
Yeah, can you tell me about it? What did that look like?
well, we had 4 grades.
Okay.
And for me, one thing was to get excited about getting my work done so I could listen to the older kids
Yeah.
and what they were doing.
Right. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Montessori school as well. That's where I currently work, where you have a lot of students working on independent things and they can learn different things. Yeah. Thanks.
I just wanted to say, Rokia, am I saying that correctly?
Rokia.
Rokia. You moved me to tears. What a wonderful, inspiring story. Thank you so much for being who you are. It's very touching.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And for Haley, because, should I come in front? So you, are you okay?
Oh, you're okay. You're okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you work at the Humphrey School, I wanted to bring up that about 3 years ago, I sponsored a conference at Humphrey School, and we had some disabled participants who were both hearing impaired and in wheelchairs, and the only way they could enter that auditorium was in the very, very back, because there was way to get down to the front. There were stairs, they would have to be in the front row. And I wondered if that's still true, and isn't that against the ADA? Could you address that? And also, what can we, as citizens, if we find out about things like that, is there like a way to report that?
So, so I do want to make a few clarifications. I don't work at the Humphrey School. I study there, but I mean, that really doesn't have any bearing on the auditorium issue. Yes, I've been in there many times. I've actually gone a number of times with other colleagues of mine that also have disabilities, and so, there's an assumption made that if you have a wheelchair, if you use a wheelchair, like you don't have other disabilities, or you're not traveling with other people that have a mixture of disabilities or other types of access needs. There is some, in terms of the ADA and Section 504, there are some exemptions that can come into play that allow certain entities not to make changes right away. There's a lot of layers to it, but I know, in my role at the DRC, at the Disability Resource Center, it tends to be that changes are made when an individual student has a specific access need. So there are lots and lots of facilities on campus that are not very accessible and should be made accessible, but the campus can, in some cases, wait to make changes until they are investing a more substantial amount of money into physical access changes, or if there is a student that has a very specific disability-related need for accessing a specific space. So it's very complicated, and believe me, it frustrates me to no end to see some of these spaces on campus. But I do think that there are opportunities for advocacy. I think that the more people that point out how ridiculous it appears to be, even if the university isn't feeling pressure to make that change right away, if more people register those complaints, I think that would be very, very helpful.
To help
Yes.
answer that, one of the rules are, or one of the regulations is, if the building is there before 1990, it does not have to do anything to make it accessible. And if there's any rehabilitation of the structure, then they would probably have to make that accessible.
Yeah.
And then the other kicker on that is that if there's a person with a disability who should participate in a class like that, they have to move the class to accommodate the individual.
And one piece of that, to add on to that, I really appreciate you sharing that, is that oftentimes instead of making changes to inaccessible spaces, they will often just move to another classroom space that's more accessible. And so that's given kind of an out to making some of those changes that really are necessary. I'm very sure of that. I'm glad that the other piece of it is the more students with disability and more community members and staff members and faculty that come to the university and have access needs, the more changes that we can continue to make. So that is a big piece of my goal at the university, is to ensure that more people are coming to begin with and getting through the various barriers that exist in higher ed.
So this is a comment for Haley. It really it really stuck with me, the fact that you're saying that a lot of organizations, when they talk about diversity, they do not even refer to disability. And I think that's been very, very true in my life, especially in the field that I'm in. It's just like diversity in terms of disability is not even considered at all. So thank you for actually mentioning that.
No, question. Okay, I'm also interested in, Saudi Arabia has a CRPD, Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, been ratified.
Yes, they signed it in 2008.
Yeah, I want to try to get some personal context of history. So I'm going to talk from a personal example, a couple of them. My dad's sister was born in 1903, lost her hearing from a disease in 1906. And she lived the entire rest of her 84 years in the deaf community. The North Dakota School for the Deaf, then in the deaf community in Los Angeles, California. Her whole society was the deaf community. That's the first example. They lived in a town where there was a school for the feeble-minded, which is basically a warehouse for everybody who was mentally disabled. I have a daughter who's Down syndrome, who's 42, and I think of that often. She's still living, and she's doing well. She's in a sheltered workshop, and she does well. The third example is I represented teachers for years, as did my colleague John Borgen, and I can remember when the special education legislation first came in. Basically, it would have been it intensified in the 1970s. But what I noticed something towards the end of my career, that there was a lot of attention paid to things like class loads, funding for special ed, and they started to dribble away over time. It cost too much. Parent advocacy groups started, and there was a lot of attention paid to it, but it seems like it's a place that's being squeezed. Now, with those three examples, would anybody like to comment about, is it better now? It is better now than it was in 1906. Is it better now than it was in 1975, for instance? Thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, Beth, you want to answer?
Yeah, I want to say something. I'm somebody who's very passionate, who's fighting a passionate fight within, doing what, the state of Vermont is, has done. Vermont no longer has sheltered workshops. And I guess I'm sorry, I'm saying that because so-called sheltered workshops pay low wages and I consider them segregating. I'm sorry, Dick, you might not agree with me, but I had the horrible experience of having worked in 5 of them, and and they treated me like crap. And at my precinct caucus, I introduced a resolution which 100% of the people agreed with me about having, something better than just so-called sheltered workshops. And at my local convention, they agreed with me. about, having what Vermont has. An alternative to so-called sheltered workshops. They're not sheltered workshops. They're places of segregation and slave factories. I'm sorry I'm being hard, but that's how I see them.
I'm
They're
giving
not-
Beth a ride home tonight, we'll have a
Talk about it, but I'm sorry, that's how I feel.
Beth, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
So from what I've heard recently, it's still on the books technically that people with disabilities, there is no minimum wage.
yeah, that's not good,
That's
and
not
I'm
good.
angry about that.
So are there like,
There should be a better wage and a right to organize into unions.
Well, and there's an exception in the Minnesota law to
That's
allow
not
that
good.
minimum wage for persons in sheltered workshop, but also agriculture workers out in the fields.
they're not protected?
No.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not going to apologize anymore. I'm sick of it.
Let's take one more. Is Kathy over? Okay, yes, we'll take one more question, and then we'll have Rick come up, and
Okay.
we'll continue after
Yeah.
Rick is done with additional questions. So, yes.
Here.
Because I went through Minneapolis Society for the Blind, and I know that they did have a sheltered workshop. I have no idea what people were paid, but I knew someone who worked in it, but I don't think Vision Loss Resources has that anymore. I don't think so anyway, but, no, it probably would feel like you were being segregated, so. I don't know, but I've never.
What did you say? Could someone summarize what she said?
She said, what did you say again? Sorry.
And I apologize, I was trying to get the.
I think she said that she had worked with the Minnesota Blind Services.
Well, I went through Minneapolis Society for the Blind, that's what it was called then. And I know they had a sheltered workshop, and I knew someone who worked in it. But I don't know if Vision Loss Resources really has that anymore. I suppose you would feel fairly segregated if you were working in it, but at
One of the
least you
things
were
is that
working.
there is a
You were doing
movement
something.
to try to give folks working in those institutions, I guess, yet, but a minimum wage. There are a couple of them in St. Paul, like Allied Services and Capoja and one other, who are giving individuals who work there minimum wage. So there is a movement towards that, which does not mean that it's already everywhere. There isn't a state law that says they must do that.
Oh, there is a state law?
No, there is not.
No, I think there needs, and the wage needs to be better than what it is.
I'm for that.
Thank you very much, and you will tell us up in a little bit. Thank you so much.
Okay. You go.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll keep us moving. And now, for one, I've had the privilege of knowing Rick Cardenas for a number of years now, when he was working with Advocating Change Together. First as an organizer for Remembering with Dignity, and then as a co-director for 19 years. Prior to that, Rick worked in the St. Paul office of Senator Paul Wellstone, and most recently is consulting on the Reconnect Rondo project. He continues consulting at Access Associates, doing physical and programmatic consulting on disabilities. So Rick's here to talk a little bit with us about sexism, racism, and disability in Minnesota and beyond, looking at physical and programmatic discrimination within the PCA system. So thank you, Rick, for being here.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming. And where did Beth go? I want to thank Beth.
I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
And Beth is not one of my promoters, but she did.
I'll be your promoter.
Oh, okay, okay. But she was suggesting that I come and speak with the group. I'm,
Well, I've known Rick since close to the end of 1984 when I was working on Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro's campaign, and throughout my involvement with advocating change together and remembering with dignity, and along with the campaign to end sexual harassment, starting with the Anita Hill saga, among other things.
thanks, Beth. I'm going to move over here. That thing is shining into my eye. That's okay. And as usual for me, I had created a slideshow, but it doesn't work there. So I'm going to probably revert back to some of the work that I presented from Advocating Change Together. But before we even get to that, I want to talk about myself, which is one of my favorite subjects. But I've been an advocate for many years, and want me to, okay. I've been an advocate for many years, and as you can see, I have a disability, very severe disability. When I was a teenager, I broke my neck, which paralyzed my body generally from my armpits all the way down to my toes, And I've been active in doing advocacy for many years. And I started with the Eugene McCarthy bid for president that maybe you've just heard recently, because the anniversary was Monday of when he first ran for the nomination for president in 1988, which pushed 68. You're right, 68. Thank you. We need those corrections. So that was the beginning of my political activism. I worked on the United Farm Workers and the many boycotts that were created then, also in the 60s. Remember back to the 60s? Okay, and so I became very active then, and as you can see, I gained a major disability, and so the politics drove me to be an advocate for persons with disabilities. And I often say I'm a product of the government, and then being a product of the government, I've had my needs being met by many things from government programs. Actually, my mobility is with this wonderful, beautiful wheelchair that I've used for over 50 years. Not this one, but many iterations of the wheelchair. So I've been active in that way. I learned my politics through my parents, who were quite active. My father used to give me information about the House Un-American Activities Committee when I was a kid. He worked nights, so he was able to watch it on television during the 50s, and so he'd give me a report on that when we got together, usually on the weekends. My awareness of politics comes from him and my mother. They were both strong unionists, and my dad would often let me know who's a Republican, who's a Democrat. So at our house, on the front lawn, we always had a political sign pushing someone, generally the more liberal guy. And my So the main thrust for my political activism came from that Eugene McCarthy peace movement and the United Farm Workers through the 60s and into the 70s. So those two things were my thrust into politics. And my new situation, my newfound new situation, being a person with a disability, led me into the disability advocacy, which has been ongoing for, well, 50 years, so a long time. And as Christy said, I worked for Advocating Change Together, and I continued that for years. After a stint of working with Senator Paul Wellstone in our St. Paul office, it always struck me how when I would make a phone call from Senator Paul Wellstone's office, everybody answered, always. They always answered, or they called me back very quickly. So that was always a thing I was trying to achieve when I worked at Advocating Change Together. But it did not work as well as working for Senator Wellstone. So, but advocating for persons with disabilities was a very rewarding job that I was lucky enough to get after working with Paul Wellstone. And when you're old, or when you're as old as I am, maybe not old, but when you're as old as I am, after you're around the Capitol a lot here in Minnesota, they know who you are for whatever reason, because you're just around. And so it's easy to get some things done. And at the Capitol, I was able to get many things done. And one of the projects that we worked on was called Remembering with Dignity. And Remembering with Dignity was a project that we began at Advocating Change Together, which was putting names on funeral stones. And the stones, markers at the state institutions all had numbers. They did not have any names on them because they were protecting the families from back in, well, we had them from the 1880s when some of the state institutions began. And we got some funds from the legislature to begin to put names on those stones, which was an ongoing project that we had at Advocating Change Together for 15, 20 years. So that was a very rewarding thing, and I saw it more as an organizing method versus versus something else. But the organizing was much easier because we had that project and we're doing that, and many politicians, both Republican and of course the Democrats, were anxious to support that because that was a piece of concrete that they could put there, and there was some evidence of that, and it was also a way to push services for persons with disability, is what I also used that project for, to remind folks they were doing that. And so getting a yes out of them for one thing was easier to get a yes out of a second thing. And that was one of the drivers of what we were attempting to do. My political thoughts were reflected in that, in the way that were external to my needs. My needs were still there. However, working on these projects, I tended to forget that I also had some needs. And so actually when I first broke my neck and was paralyzed, the services that were available were very minimal, very minimal. I was at home with my folks and with my brothers and sisters, well, one sister, brothers, and my aunts and uncles provided my cares. I didn't know that they had a Ramsey County nursing service which would assist in providing services for me. So eventually I did run into them, and they encouraged me to go to school. I didn't take them up on it, and so they suggested I take some classes. It was something that I really needed, but it was also a reflection of where I'd been. So one of my first books was a philosophy book. However, when I was in high school, I only read one book through the whole high school and gave a book report on that same book for 3 or 4 years. I happen to be a very good athlete, and so I somehow was getting a pass on the academic part of school. Our 3 previous speakers are moving so quickly. It's through academics, but my path was a little slower. My path was very much slower. So when I got that philosophy book and started studying it, I wanted to become a philosopher. And that was when I first broke my neck, and I began to read and learn to read. I read some great books like The Idiot by Dostoevsky, and that was really fascinating, and it caused me a lot of problems later, because Dostoevsky, if you've ever read that, he has sentences that are about a page long with numerous quotes or commas. I know what they are now. With numerous commas, and so when I wrote, I would write those big long sentences with numerous commas, and luckily I have some people who edit for me, which help me to cut the commas and put a period here and there. So that was always good. So let me go back to first breaking my neck. I was at St. Joe's Hospital for 6 weeks, and then transferred over to Sister Kenny in Minneapolis for rehabilitation. So I was at rehabilitation for about 6 months. 6 months, not 6 months, for 6 weeks. So then I was able to go home for Christmas and have a little respite. They had me come back to Sister Kenny, and that was 1961. And this geodesis splint, which I use right now, is something that they invented then. So the technology has not changed very much. This is the same instrument that they gave me then. Thankfully, the wheelchairs are much better technology-wise. I mean, when I first got the motorized wheelchair, when you touched it like that, when you touched the power, it would go to its max speed. So you had to, and had belts on it, rubber belts, and those would break over and over. So, and I never did. It's my lack of desire to go to the Grand Canyon, I think, right now, because I would hate to touch that and head over the Grand Canyon. So I often think of that when I'm near a precarious place. So I've only gone off a few curbs with these chairs. So so being an athlete in high school, after breaking my neck, it was a pretty dramatic change for me. But I don't really think I went into much depression. I think I adjusted rather quickly. because I had the practice of being discriminated against because I was Chicano. So I knew what it was like already before becoming a person with a disability, because discrimination was around everywhere, and so the discrimination of persons with disabilities was a little bit mellowed out by the fact that I already experienced that discrimination. And actually, when I was at Sister Kenny, I also began to notice the inherent racism of our society in a much clearer way. All of the staff there, the PCAs, the orderly, and the nurses' aides, were all people of color, mostly people of color, and so it was really a strong connection, and I had a strong connection with many of them, and I really understood that, and I felt that was a real great education for me in my perspective. And we have a lot of examples of that still today. We all know that, but we know there's written evidence and actually old signs that will show you that of back entrance, no African Americans. That's a nice word, but can drink at a particular fountain, and for sure, with Rosa Parks, no one can sit at the front of the bus if you're an African American. So those things were particularly striking to me and my experience. Back when during the '60s, when the Black Panthers, the real Black Panthers, not the movie, began, and African Americans began to look at some self-defense methods. It talked about restrictions on guns. That in California, in Oakland, led to great restrictions on guns because African Americans were beginning to arm themselves, so they outlawed rifles, automatic rifles, in California at that time, because the wrong people were getting those guns. I think part of another form of discrimination that I also began to notice was the women, which was kind of and the sexism that continues to exist today around our society, because the women also worked at the Sister Kenny. I guess even after having written some of this stuff, and I realized that was the formation of my political experience and how I observe things, is the idea that the women and the African Americans were the ones who were being discriminated against over and over again, and why was that? And I've read some things, and I continue to read things about how that came about, and what we can do about it. Actually, I have my buttons on today. They're from last week. Pass the ERA, and I believe Anita Hill. And last Thursday, I believe, was the International Day of Women. So I have my buttons on to indicate my support. Uh-oh. Hold on here. So I wanted to also tie this into the discrimination against persons with disabilities. I haven't stepped on that, and I sometimes forget, hey, that's me. I'm one of those persons with disabilities, and I think it comes from being so active in so many things, I forget, hey, that's me, I'm trying to help me. So we'll show some of that later, not quite yet, to show where some of the evidence, pictured evidence of some of that discrimination against persons with disability over a number of years. The idea that did I knock this mic off? No, okay. The idea of education, as the women before me were showing, mine is much more experiential, although I did go to Hamlin and have a degree from there. I went to the School of Social Work and at the university, but ICI wasn't around then. I believe that began with a big federal grant, or started with a big federal grant a number of years ago, and probably before ADA. So it was a study of persons with disability, more academic perspectives of the persons with disability. But my experience, and as I've said earlier, I see myself as a product of government, and the reason I describe myself as that is because this beautiful wheelchair is what I have received from the government. I'm on a particular program that allows me to work a certain degree and still receive PCA services. It's called medical assistance for persons with disabilities. And that was only passed a few years ago. But I've been able to take advantage of that and work and still receive medical assistance. So this wheelchair is one of those technical things that you can really see and is obvious. However, a greater service that I receive is the PCA services, personal care attendants. And personal care attendants allow me to be here. The services I receive are from my toe to my hair, and I'm very particular about my hair. But because I don't have function of my hands, I don't walk, but I'm still able to get around, able to move about because of services from the government. The government says that I can receive services in Minnesota. All of the services are different in different states. Recently I was notified by a group in Houston, Texas, and two things. They happened to be on documents. They were all Latinos and using wheelchairs and had different disabilities. And they wanted to know if I knew a way to help them in Texas. I said, the only help I could give you is to suggest you move to Minnesota.
And did they?
No, they haven't done that. They haven't done that. But there's not but they, in Texas, even if you're legal, it's just a terrible place to be. You cannot get any durable medical equipment, bandages, for wounds, or, I mean, it's just terrible, and it's hard to even think that they're Americans. They're just cruel. But we're getting used to being having cruel people around us, directing us, I think. But we have to do something about that. Let's see here. So there are other things that I receive that I would not receive if we did not have those sort of services in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we also, our medical assistance program allows people to have teeth fixed, which, if you can imagine that, not having your teeth fixed, because in Texas it's much cheaper. They may do something in Texas, but it's much cheaper to pull all of your teeth out and give you false teeth. So that's just, again, cruel. I was going to show some slides about persons with disabilities, of my general belief of what the system, our system of government has done to persons with disabilities. And well, let's look at it. I don't want to talk about that.
Because we want to make sure
Yeah,
we get
let's
time for
and
questions and answers in there. Should we do
Okay,
5
yeah.
minutes of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
These are some of the steps that were beginning to be taken back in the mid-1800s. Another one of the movers and shakers from those days, Seguin. This is one of the methods they used to try to cure people, and this is focused on persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as we call them today. Prior to that, they were just a person with a disability. And Dorothea Dix, who is relatively famous, if you want to read that slide, and that was the language, and she was someone who cared about these folks. This is what they look like, and again, someone was talking earlier about a school, and this is what, you know, they were calling the state institutions. Faribault was called the school for idiots and morons. So it was a school. So this is sort of housing that they had back a few years ago. That's only 1825. In Philadelphia, they would take people, but you know, we didn't have a public school system as we have today, but they would take people off the streets, and supposedly they were all the delinquents, which they probably were, you know, if you couldn't go, if you had no education, if they wouldn't help you learn the way we have tried to do it. Take them into reform school. There's Dorothea again. It's a school for the idiotic and the feeble-minded. So, I mean, our cruelty was, in goodness, these were steps forward, if you can understand that things were worse than that prior. One of the schools in New York. These are the numbers of folks that I think that the reason for the increase in the numbers of persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities, or whatever we were calling them, is because they began to discover there was a difference between a difference of people learning and trying to lessen the negativity. There were some European steps that were being taken by numbers of reformers. This was a plan that came about to get people out into the fresh air and have them work. Work on farms. Part of the discrimination of the United States. The Undesirable Act, if they were undesirable, they couldn't come. We have a little bit of that going on right now. this is the way Cincinnati saw it. This is what they were thinking of the individuals as delinquents, you know, but so they would look at the problem like that for persons with disabilities. Or this, which over at Advocating Change Together, we had a few women, when I first began there over 20 years ago, that had been sterilized. And they used to do that at Faribault State Hospital, School for the Feeble-Minded. And the women, if they got a job with in the wealthy areas, they had to make sure they were sterilized before they went and worked in someone's house as a maid. And the purpose of that, we understand, or we can surmise, is because they would be raped by the people who are in charge. So during the war, there was poisoning and gassing of persons with disabilities. Only 200,000 people. This was a particular hospital that the Germans had for persons with disabilities. But then we began to get some civil rights moving forward as people began to protest in England. I think that was England. This is the way people had to live when they were in the institution. Those were all filled with persons with various disabilities who would rarely get out of bed, but be in the hospital or as a hospital. Or if they wet the bed, they would end up with a rubber mattress. Okay, that's good. I think that's good. Okay, so this is the way persons with disabilities were treated for many years. And right now, we have to look and try to figure out, what are we doing then? What level of cruelty are we doing right now to persons with disabilities? And what are some of the steps we can take to stop that? I guess I try to tie it to humiliation. When you look at some of those slides, to destroy people's self-import, the humiliation that you must feel and not be able to express it. And I kind of attribute that to the feminist movement, to their understanding what that humiliation movement is, what that humiliation is when you, because you're a woman, cannot do particular things, which would extend also to the racism that we see around us. What is humiliation? And I don't know if you were able to see any of the shows on Channel 2 last month. It was the African American month, and so they were showing a number of videos, a number of stories about African Americans and the racism of the United States, which is plenty of documentation for. One of the scenes that strikes me is that at that humiliating level is when they lined up a number of African Americans with their shorts just on their, they had all of them, their clothes off, but just lined them up on a wall and exposed in their shorts. For what purpose did they do that? To humiliate those folks. So when we look at persons with disability, living in those institutions was humiliating. Working at the sheltered workshops, in quotes, is that humiliation. So.
Well, I might open it up. Thank you very much. I might open it up with just a first question, because I don't think you really touched on it too much. Maybe you could give us a little bit of hope and activism around the Rondo project.
Oh.
Aren't you working on current
Yeah,
action?
the Rondo project, or Reconnect Rondo, is a project that is happening along I-94. I-94 is scheduled to have all of the bridges removed and put new bridges in. And one of the concepts that we've come up from one other organization, Friendly Streets Initiative, and created the Reconnect Rondo, was to put a land bridge over the top of 3 blocks, hopefully 3 blocks of I-94 between Lexington and Dale, similar to the one we have up here. But this is a planned one with community input and community participation in what should be there. Rondo was the African American center of economic activity for many years, until the freeway came and wiped the entire neighborhood apart, wiped it out and separated 2 pieces of it, from near University to then all the way over to Selby Avenue. So those 2 pieces were separated, and the Rondo and the Reconnect Rondo is a project to try to bring the community back together and try to minimize that racism that was evident to create the I-94 freeway. So that's what we're working on.
Thank you. All right, other questions?
Am I allowed to ask a question as a...
Yes, you can. I think he asked a number of questions for you.
So I was just thinking, so I consider your generation like the original generation that took on disability rights and pride and power in a very meaningful, progressive way. Certainly there were movements prior to that, but not with the same level of coordination and publicity. And I'm from what I consider the ADA generation. So I grew up knowing the Americans with Disabilities Act for most of my life, having that in place. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, as part of this generation that really kicked off disability rights and civil rights, looking at intersectional movements, with the Black Panthers and them getting involved in some of the protests that disability rights leaders were taking on.
Yeah.
What do intersectional movements look like now? What do you think has changed from then to now?
Well, from then, they began, I believe, they began with the community action programs of Lyndon Johnson. And that was a movement that began because of the funding to provide these community action projects around the country. And community action, one of the elements was it to encourage people to begin to participate. They offered daycare, they offered meals at the meeting, and they had enormous boards of community people participating in that. That one program, community action programs, was big in the Twin Cities and many parts of the country, and I think it was only natural that the disability rights movement hooked onto that as one of its tenets, that people Nothing About Me Without Me, because that's where it began. Or that's where it kind of began, because there was probably something also before that. But then when the 504 was passed, and then when IDEA came, all of these things were generating. And in 1976 here in Minnesota, they brought a suit against the state institutions and won that suit and began to deinstitutionalize all of these institutions in Minnesota. So those actions were something that individuals had pushed for and organizations had pushed for a number of years. So I think that those are reasons that it moved forward. I was a part of that. So.